Today we're looking at Chapter 6, which is about colonization and economic expansion. In this chapter, we'll explore how European colonization reshaped the Americas and how a global economy began to take shape. We'll also look at how capitalism and the Industrial Revolution transformed societies. So by the end of this lecture, you should have a clear understanding of the motives for colonization, the ways Europeans interacted with indigenous people, how global trade networks developed, and how capitalism and industrialization laid the groundwork for our modern world. Let's begin with colonization in the Americas. European powers didn't all approach colonization the same way, but their motives often overlapped. They were wealth, spreading Christianity, and gaining political prestige. Sometimes those are summarized as the 3 Gs: gold, God, and glory. The Spanish were among the earliest colonizers. They toppled empires like the Aztecs and Incas, they imposed colonial administrations, and created a racial hierarchy in which Spaniards and their descendants were at the top. But the Spanish didn't act alone. Indigenous groups often chose sides. For example, the Tlaxcalans allied with Spanish explorer Cortez against the Aztecs. Sometimes these alliances gave local groups some short-term advantages, though in the long run, colonial rule devastated indigenous autonomy. The French focused more on trade, especially the fur trade in North America. Their colonies were fewer and smaller, but they relied really heavily on alliances with indigenous people. The French traders and Jesuit missionaries often even lived among the native groups, which built cooperative relationships, although they weren't always equal. The English colonies were more varied. Some, like the colony of Virginia, were established by joint stock companies for profit. Others, like Massachusetts Bay, were created by Puritans who were seeking religious freedom and social freedom. Over time, English colonies developed strong agricultural economies, often relying on enslaved African labor, and they also created some relatively independent political structures that would later fuel revolution. For the natives, the indigenous people, colonization brought devastation. Diseases like smallpox and measles wiped out enormous populations. Military conquest, forced labor, and displacement compounded the losses. Still, the indigenous groups resisted where they could, sometimes through direct conflict and sometimes through adaptation or strategic cooperation. By the mid-18th century, colonization had set the stage for a truly global economy. European powers competed fiercely for overseas colonies and the wealth they provided. One turning point was the 7 Years' War, from 1754 to 1763. This was a global conflict that involved Europe, North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Britain emerged as the big winner, gaining new territories in North America and consolidating its presence in India. France lost much of its empire, shifting the balance of power then toward Britain. A central feature of this new economy was the role of joint stock companies like the British East India Company. These companies really blurred the line between commerce and government, so between business and government. They raised capital, they traded goods, and they maintained their own armies. So in many cases, they laid the groundwork for direct colonial rule. Let's look at China, which at this time maintained strict control over foreign trade through the Canton system. European traders could only operate in one port, Canton, and they had to work through licensed Chinese merchants in order to have that opportunity. Europe had an insatiable demand for Chinese goods, especially things like tea and silk and porcelain, but China really wasn't interested in European goods at all. As a result, silver flowed steadily into China, creating a favorable trade balance for the Qing dynasty and a drain on the European economies. In Africa, colonization and economic competition also played out. In Portuguese, the Ndongo Dutch against the Khoisan and the Xhosa, and the British against the Entente all faced resistance from African states and communities. These encounters demonstrate that colonized people were not passive victims. They did fight back, they negotiated, and they adapted to shifting circumstances as needed. While in the Americas, colonists themselves began to resist imperial control. British attempts to regulate colonial trade and impose taxes after the very costly 7 Years' War sparked anger in North America, setting the stage for revolution. So we see a pattern starting to develop. Colonization drove the rise of the global economy, but it also created tensions and resistances from both indigenous societies and from the colonists themselves. So now let's look at capitalism and industrialization. Capitalism emphasizes private investment, profit seeking, and market exchange, while earlier mercantilist policies focused on strict government control of trade and the accumulation of bullion. Capitalism increasingly relied on private entrepreneurs and financial markets and less direct state management. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the 18th century. A series of technological innovations like the spinning jenny, the power loom, and the steam engine, all of those things revolutionized textile production and transportation. Coal and iron fueled these new industries, and steam power expanded both manufacturing and mobility. The social consequences of the Industrial Revolution were immense. Rural families migrated to cities and formed a new industrial working class. Factory work meant long hours and dangerous conditions. Also, very little pay, because if someone didn't like a job, there was always someone else waiting to take it. If someone got hurt at a job, there wasn't something like workman's comp to pay for that, like that insurance to be off work. There was always someone ready to replace a person. At the same time, we had this new middle class emerging. They're entrepreneurs, they're factory owners and managers and professionals. All of them benefited from economic growth. Globally, industrialization deepened the divide between industrialized nations and their colonies. The colonies were drawn further into global networks as suppliers of raw materials like cotton and sugar and minerals, and as captive markets for European manufactured goods. This pattern reinforced economic dependency and inequality that still echoes in the modern world. Industrialization had environmental consequences too. Coal mining scarred landscapes, factories polluted rivers, and urbanization created crowded, unsanitary conditions in cities. At the same time, industrial goods and technology spread worldwide, which reshaped how societies worked and lived. So let's briefly take a look at 3 case studies. 1. Under British rule, the East India Company introduced new revenue systems that disrupted traditional agriculture and shifted production toward cash crops and undermined local industries like textiles. India became increasingly dependent on Britain's industrial economy. China's Canton system. China's strict regulation of trade kept European merchants on the defensive for much of the 18th century. But by the 19th century, the imbalance of trade would become a flashpoint, especially with Britain's introduction of opium. And in the Atlantic plantations, the plantation economies of the Americas, powered by enslaved African labor, provided sugar, tobacco, and cotton for European markets. This system tied together Africa, the Americas, and Europe in one of the most exploitive economic networks in history. So just to summarize, colonization in the Americas was created new societies, devastated indigenous populations, and enriched European powers. Global trade networks tied together Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas, often to the benefit of Europe and to the detriment of colonized people. Capitalism and industrialization transformed economies and societies and created new classes, new inequalities, and lasting environmental and political impacts. I'd also add too, because it mentioned um, the detriment of colonized peoples, would say that this type of the Atlantic plantations also brought about the detriment of the people who were enslaved for the benefit of this economy. Capitalism and industrialization transformed economies and societies. They grew new classes. They also grew new inequalities and a lasting environmental and political impact. The legacies of this era are still visible today in global trade imbalances, in the persistence of colonial borders, and in debates about economic equality between nations.